Hello everyone, it's Gigabeef here, and today we're going to be thinking about the age-old question, to insure or not to insure. But of course, if it were that easy, this video would be very short, so let's dive in and take a more detailed look. Just before we get going, as a very broad overview, I'd say that in general, insurance is worth it most of the time, and especially with budget kits. High-end attachments are really the ones most at risk, so if you are either going to insure everything or insure nothing, it's almost certainly better to insure everything if you're not sure. So for the sake of completeness, let's go over how insurance works for newer players. I will try to be as brief as possible while including all the useful tidbits of information and nuances that are important around insurance and its concept. If you know this stuff already, feel free to skip to the next chapter in the video. In short, you pay money to give items an insured status, which can be seen in the inventory with the yellow outline around the item. Once an item is insured, when it's brought into raid, if that item remains within the map when the timer hits 0, i.e. it wasn't extracted by somebody, yourself or someone else, then you get it back after a delay. One notable exception is if you go missing in action, as in if the timer runs out while you're still in the raid, the items that are on your PMC are not returned even if they're insured. So if that's going to happen, throw everything on the floor beforehand if you aren't going to make it, for example if there's only 10 seconds left on the clock and you're nowhere near the extract. Insurance is also per item. If you insure a bag and have looted some stuff in a raid, you'll get the bag back but not the items that were inside it. Same with guns. If you insure the base weapon and afterwards add some mods that you don't insure, you'll just get the gun itself along with any parts that were insured previously. Rappor's boys are very good at making sure that you don't get anything back that you didn't pay for. Oh, and insurance doesn't work on the map labs. You can insure with Prapor or Therapist. Prapor is cheaper and so is used the vast majority of the time by most players, but Therapist returns items more quickly once lost and keeps them for 6 days rather than 4, so that can be specifically better for players who can't log in during the week, as once the time limit runs out after the items get returned to the trader, they are then no longer retrievable by the player from the trader. The way that insurance works means that frauding or scamming is the best way to maximize your loot in raid. Throwing away your own gear to take other people's amplifies how much you can bring out, because then you'll get your own items back later at just the cost of insurance if you hide them well. It used to be the case that you'd just insure everything in EFT. A little while back, the insurance costs were ramped up through the roof, and now it's much more nuanced as to whether you should or should not insure certain items, and as we'll see, there are lots of factors to consider if you want to attempt to make the correct choice. This is definitely more art than science, so the idea of this video is to think more critically about the factors involved and decide yourself on a case-by-case basis rather than a prescriptive guide on exactly what to do. Essentially, the broad thought process goes as follows. If I die, what is the likelihood of my body being looted? If it gets looted, what is the chance that the player decides to take each of my items? Once looted, how likely is it that that player then gets out of the raid themselves? These questions are aimed at estimating the chance that we lose an item in a way that breaks the insurance that we've purchased. Once we've decided on this chance, then finally we ask how much does the insurance cost for us versus the item's replacement cost, and does that make up for the times that the insurance doesn't work? The easiest way to think about this is what is the insurance cost as a percentage of the item's cost, and how does this compare to the chance of getting it back? If the cost is higher, we shouldn't insure, and if it's lower, then we should. A simple example to make this point more obvious. If you're using a Tarzan as your tactical rig, you should get it back over 90% of the time because very few players will take them. Because the return chance is so high, it only costs 5k for me to insure and can be bought using hunting matches for around 10k, even though the insurance is 50% of the item's cost, the 90% chance that we get it back means that we should insure it. In this case, even if you don't want to use it when it comes back, they sell to Ragman for 12k, so this makes the insurance basically a no-brainer. On the other hand, insuring a suppressor or a scope is much less compelling. For argument's sake, let's say you get something back 25% of the time, which is mostly when you die to scavs or insurance fraud your weapon. Attack 30, for example, cost me 8k to insure, but only 30k to buy a new one, so the insurance is 27% of the item's value. This means that because of the low return chance combined with a relatively high cost, it's not as worth it to insure, as over 4 raids where we die, we only expect to get it back once, costing us 32,000 in insurance over the 4 raids, but only 30k to buy a new one if we hadn't insured. Overall, it's this combination of the chance to get it back versus how much the insurance costs in total, which is the difference between the price of insurance and the item itself's replacement cost that matters. Factor 2 is intrinsically linked to the first one, which is your trader level. This was not always the case, but these days your trader level affects the price of insurance, which changes our thought process around whether it's worth it or not. The higher your level, the more it costs, which some players have been complaining about since its introduction. Now, I don't have my own testing on this because, as you can imagine, it's very time consuming to check for each level due to the progression system and questing, but there was a table that I found produced by Prior Ad on Reddit with the relative percentages of costs at each level for Prapor and Therapist that seem reasonable. Although I can't verify it specifically, it gives us a broad idea of how it functions. So far, we've only dealt with the factors affecting the actual insurance price, which is the easiest piece of the puzzle. Next, we need to think about what affects the chance that we get looted. This brings us on to factor 3, which is honestly one of the biggest and most important: solo versus squad play. Insurance is usually much better when playing with a team because the chances of getting looted are dramatically decreased when you have other players to ditch your insured gear or to finish and win the fight that you died in. If your squad is halfway decent and not just a confused ball of players that gets wiped together by one guy, and believe me, I've been part of those squads in the early days, insurance is basically a no-brainer most of the time. Even if you all die to one guy, they won't actually be able to take 2 people's or 3 people's worth of stuff, so the lower value items at least should come back, for example in a 3v1. Where the decision gets more complicated is when playing solo, because any time you die to a PMC, you pretty much get stripped. Fighting versus duos, if you die, you get your stuff split between 2 players. If you kill one and not the other, you get your stuff taken by the remaining guy. Only if you manage to kill both do you not lose your things, and then the insurance wasn't even used. You have to ditch your own gear to take theirs out in order to get value out of the insurance that you purchased. Now, we've spoken a lot about being killed by PMCs, which is clearly where insurance matters the most, and this brings us on to factor 4, which are you playing for scav or PMC kills? If PMC, you're obviously going to be losing your stuff more often because they will be right there to loot you. If you die to scavs, especially in forested or bushy areas, it's unlikely anyone will find your body, and so you'll usually have your stuff returned. Before you head into a raid, you'll have some idea of what you're going to do, which is where factor 5 comes in. When are you likely to die in the raid, and where? The earlier you die, the more likely you are to lose the kit. Later on, there are less players to begin with, and most have already looted something, so potentially are more unwilling to loot you. You can make a guess of this depending on how long you intend to stay in the raid. It doesn't always work out that way, but typically you'll know if you're rushing hotspots or taking it slow and playing for quests. Where you are likely to die also matters, as being further from extracts is a benefit for insurance. Sometimes on maps like Shoreline, the fights at the spawns on the east side of the map then require players to successfully navigate all the way across to either tunnel or path to lighthouse, and they have a much higher chance of dying doing that with your stuff than on maps with easier exits where they can skulk out of the side with your loadout. Another fighting factor on factor 6 is long versus short range. The closer you are, the easier it is for your opponent to secure your loot once you die. Sometimes in sniper battles, even if you win, it can be really hard to find the enemy's body, so longer range gives you a better chance of insurance success. Factor 7 is the map itself. Factory for me is these days a no insurance map, unless for a very specific piece of budget gear, but they're going to have to be of really low value in the first place, like spare mags and maybe a bad rig or a bag, which means it's of low value to insure in the first place. Player scavs go around and strip everything in Factory, and there's nowhere to hide, and so pretty much everything gets lost if you die on that map. The bigger the map, the further the extract, the more grassy and forested it is, the better chance you have of recovering items that you take in when you die. If we do get looted, this is where factor 8 comes in, which is item value and size. Other people will want to take items that have a high value like scopes and attachments, and will be looking at price per slot like any other loot item. Those that have a high value per slot will get taken first, with weapons and armor typically being left behind. Sometimes it's worth insuring just the base gun and leaving the suppressors and optics uninsured for this reason. Another thing to consider is the current state of the patch and relative gear progression for all players. Your gear, in relation to the average player, will partly determine what gets taken. Using a Corund armor in the first month will almost certainly be scooped up because players typically can't access them yet on the trader, but in 3 months, many people can, so the value is diminished and the chance of it being returned goes up. The final factor, factor 10, is the other items in your loadout such as bags and rigs that can go back and affect everything else that you have on you. For this, the TV110 usually springs to mind. People love using these rigs for the space they have, and they're very efficient to pack everything into, but I'm much less fond of them due to having 2 slots for your headset and helmet, neatly positioned to remove all of your items from the raid when you're looted, as well as being 4x3 and fitting neatly into other people's bags. They're efficient for you, but that means they're also as efficient for your opponents too. Just carrying one of these decreases the chance that you'll get any of your stuff back because you're effectively delivering them a nice box to pop all your gear into to take out of the raid with them. Now that we've gone through most of the important things to bear in mind, let's take a look at a few examples practically because this may be more useful than just the theory. So the first loadout we're going to look at here is a reserve MP7 loadout, and so what we're going to be doing with this on reserve is probably either going underground or we're going to be fighting in buildings, so we're going to be quite close range to people, and the extracts on reserve are not that difficult to get out of. I know D2 is kind of notorious, but you can extract relatively easily if you want to, as long as there's not too many people around downstairs, and you can also go up onto the cliff up to the sniper dome to extract there if you have Red Rebel and a paracord. And so on that basis, our kit is going to be kind of at risk. Let's start at the top with the Razor headset. So these are normally about 35k on the flea. To insure for 8,000 means we need to get them back roughly 25% of the time, which I think probably will happen. People do like these headsets, but they're not amazing value in terms of slot value, and so normally barter items will replace this and people won't pick them up unless they're insurance falling their own headset. The next one, the Ratnik, I think this is a clear insure. At 8k, these are only 20,000, but these come back almost every single time. You can barter them for 2 bleaches, and so people don't really use them. Level 3 helmet also is not that great, and again, it's 4 slots that could be replaced by something else, and so unless there really is just empty space, people normally won't pick this up. The Shamar, I quite like these because they cover your face really nicely. They look really good on your PMC. For only 1k, I think you may as well just do this. You get these back quite often because people don't want to pick them up and keep them in their rig if there's any space for anything else. Now, onto the weapon, the MP7A2. I just went to go and check out what this build would cost you from the flea, and I can buy the suppressor from Mechanic, which is the most expensive part, about 60k. This whole build, all in, costs around 200,000 rubles. So insuring for 43k is quite a lot, but the weapon's worth a decent amount. But unfortunately, that's about 23%, and I just don't think you get the MP7 back enough. The big problem with the MP7 is that you can take the suppressor off, and that's a 1x2. You can take the magazine out, and that's a 1x2, like you can see here. And then you can fold down the stock, and the gun itself becomes 1x2 with the optic on it. So it's a nightmare for insurance. This thing you almost never ever get back. Maybe I might go inspect, and I might insure just the magazine, potentially, because people might not take those. But I really don't think that this is worth insuring on a map like Reserve. Definitely not on a map like Factory, but I don't think so on Reserve either. Some of the bigger maps, maybe, if it's not as modded, but the fact it's got so many mods on, I just don't think it's worth it. The Tactec, on the other hand, this is great on Reserve because it allows you to extract out of the dome extract without having to mess around with your kit because you don't actually have a body armor on. This only costs 27k, which I think is a no-brainer. This is very, very good. The Tactec is not amazing in terms of storage space because it doesn't have any 2x2s and the slots are sort of limited, and so people might replace their own armor with it, but it's not taken all that often. I actually get Tactecs back more often than you'd think now that people can access level 5 armor fairly readily at this point in the wipe. The final one is the Beat2 bag. This costs 12,000 to insure. On the flea market, these are up at about 70k. And yes, this will get taken relatively often, but I think given that ratio, it's actually worth it to insure this. People will use this to put other stuff in because if this goes into another bag of similar size, you get 1 extra space because it takes up slightly less space than it gives here. But I still think, given the cost, if this was a little bit more, if this was 20,000 or 25,000, then I don't think it would be worth it. But given that it's only 12k, I think it probably is worth insuring in this case. The next loadout we're going to be looking at is one that I've been thinking of because I've been doing silent caliber and setup recently using the shotguns on customs. So because we're on customs is kind of a middle ground map for insurance. It's not too bad. The extracts are quite far at either end of the map, although it is sort of linear-ish and it's not too hard to get out if people want to. But there are some bushes, there's some grassy areas, but there's also industrial too, so it's kind of a mixed bag. If we go down from the top, I think the Razor headset on this map is still worth an insure, 7.8k versus about 30-35k on the flea. The Ushanka, if you're going to be completing this quest over a couple of days and you're not right near the end, then this is definitely worthwhile because you don't want to keep buying these off the flea if you can, and people typically won't pick them up unless they're keeping them for their own quest. So at 1,300, you may as well. And the same thing with the brown version of the Shamar. This is only 1,000. I use one or the other in all of my raids, so I insure these because a lot of people just don't take them. In terms of the Condors, now these are actually quite expensive to buy from Prapor. They're about 17,000 rubles. So for 3k, I think it's worth it because people tend not to pick them up. You do get them lost sometimes, but a lot of the time people don't bother because they're really bad slot value. So unless they don't have anything on, or sometimes they just don't notice and don't think that there's any value in these. I kind of like them because they've got this medium ricochet chance and armor class 1, so you think I may as well, especially towards the end game once money becomes less of a problem. Would I buy these if I was trying to min-max my outfit? Probably not, but in this case, I'm going to get them and I'm going to insure them as well. Now, the armor, the gel, this one is an interesting one. So it costs you 29,000 rubles to insure. I personally would say yes, do insure this, because people don't often like taking these, and if we're running this particular loadout without a helmet, the chance that we get shot in the head and then this doesn't get looted is higher than it would be normally. So you could get this back completely undamaged. If you do get it back damaged, I'll show you in a second. I actually have one of these in my inventory. When I died recently, got it back at 0, and it still sells for 32,000 defense. So you do actually make 3,000 rubles, even if it comes back completely zeroed. So I do think it's worth getting it back. If you're running a cheap kit like this, you can repair it once, twice, maybe not 3 times, but 2 times to make it economic to get it back into your stash. And so I think I probably would overall insure this, but this is kind of borderline as a tricky one. Right, onto the shotgun. Now this one is interesting. It's going to cost us 46,000 rubles to insure the entire thing, which relative to the MP7's cost that we saw in the previous example, it does seem like quite a lot. Although, to be fair, I am using the thermal scope on this, which is about 30k off the flea. I'm using a EFT scope, and I'm also using the Salvo 12 sound suppressor. Now, normally because this weapon is so large, it's 2 slots wide, and unlike normal shotguns, because it has this stock on it, it makes it extra big. The beauty of this is that you do normally get it back. Now, if I was really trying to min-max this properly, what I probably would do is not insure the suppressor, because that's one thing that almost never comes back when it does get looted by PMCs, and there are a lot of PMCs on customs. So I'd maybe deselect this, because these are only worth 30k on the flea market, and as you can see it costs about 9,000 rubles, and I think it probably gets taken more than a third of the time, so let's not take that. The optic on the other hand is a tricky one because this is about 25k, but we can see it only costs 4,500, it's about 5,000 rubles to insure. So it's a really difficult one. I think this is probably on the borderline. I don't think you necessarily make or lose money particularly. You need to basically have it taken less than about 1 in 5, so 20% of the time to make this worthwhile. I think it probably gets taken about 20% of the time. So whether you don't insure it or do insure it, it's probably up to you. If something's on the borderline, typically I will insure it because there are those random situations where you get shot in the head by a scav or something, or people just don't find your body, or they kill you but they get killed by somebody else, which can happen quite easily on customs, and then your stuff either be lost or forgotten or someone doesn't have time to loot. So in a borderline situation, normally I err on the side of insuring if I'm unsure. As for the rest of the loadout, I think the same thing applies with the Ushanka as it does with the scav vest. Let's just deselect these ones. Then it only costs 1,000 to insure, and this is going to cost you 20k if you buy it straight off the flea market, or 12,000 if you use the Slickers bar. So if you're going to be using these more, keep making sure that you're getting them back cycling through insurance so you can finish the quest easily. Then onto the Bearcut bag. This bag is slightly smaller, it's only 5k to insure, and these people have so many of them that generally this kind of size of bag, any that is 4x5, they don't get taken. So the Bearcut, the Scav backpack, any of those like that, they typically don't get taken by people unless someone is trying to bag stack, but most people's bag stacks at this point are pretty large, and so unless you're really running into a ton of scavs or something, they don't usually get taken. So I think this is worthwhile. This just ensures that you have a decent supply of bags within your inventory. Hopefully these 2 examples have given you some idea of the things that you might want to consider when deciding what to insure, and I tried to look at some borderline middle tier kits because that's typically where the decisions are the hardest. Any kits that are more budget than this, you should pretty much be insuring no matter what, as the chance that they come back is normally so high relative to the insurance cost. For kits that are more expensive, you might start erring on the side of not insuring for certain items like weapon mods that are hard to come by, or armors like the Slick that almost always get taken. Just coming back to what I said earlier about factory, during the Punisher tourney trials I lost about 20 Slicks near the end of the Wipe 2 patches ago, and I did not get a single one back in insurance. However, if you're using those kits, then typically min-maxing the insurance doesn't really matter to you anyway now. So as usual, if you learned something, please consider dropping a like and a comment. To see when I'm streaming, you can follow me on Twitter and Twitch. Check out our Scav Talk podcast in the links below, and with all that said, I'll see you next time, and as always, have fun in your raids.